Okay, welcome back. I am here with Lydia for part 3. What are we talking about in this series, Lydia?
We're talking about language learning, and I think we're actually going into really practical tips here.
Yeah.
I like this conversation with you where we actually find out we agree with each other on most of the topics, but it might be something that's new to most listeners, I guess.
Yeah. A lot of great stuff coming up. This is part 3, so if you haven't watched the first 2 parts, please go back and do that because it's going to make a lot more sense. Also, a quick reminder, this series is available on YouTube, on the podcast, the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, and on the blog as well. So whichever way you prefer to consume this, it is there for your viewing, listening, reading pleasure. All right, then. So in part 1, we covered the fundamental mindsets of language learning, the attitude and mindset that you have to have as a student coming in to learn a new language and how that affects your outcome. In part 2, we talked about the importance of prioritizing and creating time and what happens if you don't. And in part 3, we're really getting into the meat of it. We're going to be talking about what do you actually do when you sit down to learn a language. So Lydia, what do you do?
Well, the very, very important thing here is to decide what activities you will practice, right? And I always ask people at the beginning, so what do you want to do in the language? Like, what is your goal? I mean, do you want to write scientific papers in the language? Or do you want to travel and use the language when speaking? Or do you just want to understand? I mean, I know people who are just happy understanding Hungarian newspapers. They don't really want to speak the language, right? So what is your goal? And then depending on that, you should realize, or you should decide what activities you will practice. Because if your goal is to travel and use the language with native speakers, then you should definitely concentrate on speaking and listening as the 2 most important activities, and you should give them most time. I think this is really crucial. And many people don't realize it because like there are easy apps like we've mentioned, Duolingo, for example, but many other apps which are like very playful and they give you some basic knowledge of the vocabulary. They don't really make you speak the language, and this is really important. So I think the first question for everyone is to realize, what am I doing with the language, and is this bringing me closer to the goal of using the language as I want to use it, right?
Yeah, so I guess the idea here is that we have an endpoint. We know where we're going, what we want to do with the language, and then the method that we use should be a method that actually gets us to our endpoint, what we want to do, right? There's a often run into here is that people, if you ask your average language learner, what's your goal in the language? Most people will say, oh, well, I want to speak it fluently.
Yeah, and that's a good goal. I mean, that's a good direction.
Well, it's a good aspiration, isn't it? It's a good thing to hope for. But the trouble is, how do you get from, what do you say to someone then if they articulate their goals as, well, I want to speak fluently? Like, how do you reverse engineer the activities? Because if the idea here was we're going to choose our activities to meet our goal, well, what's an activity that ends up in fluency?
Sure. So if you want to fluently, we have the word speak in there, which kind of gives us a hint of what we need to practice most of all. Let's say this person is really interested in just speaking, and we make sure that they don't want to read books in the language, and they don't want to write emails, let's say company emails or something. Then I would say, okay, you don't need to practice these 2 skills very, very much. You don't need to concentrate so much on writing and on reading. Maybe, if you really just want to speak, you might not worry too much about the spelling. Let's say, for example, in a language like French, I always aimed for a conversational fluency in French. So my spelling is pretty bad, right? If someone writes me an email, I think they might think that my level in French is a bit lower than it really is because I never bothered too much about the spelling. I never practiced writing a lot. But I aimed for conversational fluency, so I had a lot more conversations in French, right?
Sure.
So, and as for, of course, with speaking, you necessarily need to understand the other people. I mean, unless you want your speaking ability to be a monologue and just, give a speech or something, you will probably want to understand what the other person is saying. And for that purpose, you will need to practice a lot of listening. So if you want to speak a language fluently, if that's your goal, then you should concentrate most of your learning time on speaking and listening. That would be my main tip.
So I guess that applies particularly as you go through the process of learning, as you progress to different stages. It's a good reference point. It's a good question to ask yourself, isn't it? Like, okay, you walk into a bookshop and it's like, I don't know, 100 email templates for French business or something. You know, having an awareness that actually, yeah, you could get that, but really, all you really care about is speaking with people. You know,
right.
It's a good way to guide impression. All right, so how do you approach the very beginning then? What are your kind of guiding principles for first starting to learn it?
Yeah. So I don't know about you. I'm not a big fan of the speaking from the first day on approach, which means that you know, that is one of the approaches to speak right from the beginning. But I actually suggest to people to get more input before they start with the output. Just checking with you, Olly, if you're there and everything's okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. So that means there is one approach to speak right from the start, but I actually go for input first, and I'm not necessarily just speaking about people who are beginners in language learning. Let's put it more broadly as people who have had some language exposure before. Maybe they attended some classes in school, maybe several years of language learning, as we know it. It's usually the case. And maybe they tried a little bit here, a little bit there. Maybe they went for a language course and it never worked out, so they don't feel confident. I would actually recommend to them to start to give it 1 month of, let's say, 1 hour a day, listening and reading. So make it more passive input, and then after 1 month, concentrate on speaking, right? So
listening and reading. So what does that look like from a kind of study or from an activity perspective? I mean, you sit down and just, what do you read? What do you listen to?
Yeah. I think that it's really important to have the fun part in language learning. So it shouldn't be just a lot of hard work. It should be fun and enjoyable for me personally. And that's why my most favorite method to practice listening comprehension is watching TV shows, series. So I'm a big fan. Like, I've seen so many series on Netflix or, you know, whatever websites that stream series, and I find it really the best way. I find them much better than movies, because if you find one good series, you can get hooked. If you get hooked, you don't really need to think about, do I want to do this? Is it necessary? It's like, I want to watch the next episode, right? And I find them also a lot easier to understand audio-wise. So I think series are really the best. And of course, people always ask with or without subtitles, right? So actually, I would be interested to know what is your take on that? Do you recommend watching with subtitles?
I mean, the thing about watching TV when you're as a beginner is that it's pretty hard to understand what's going on.
We're not talking about total beginners, though, right? Let's say people who had some language exposure before.
Right. Okay.
But they're like beginner in the language learning process, like learning by themselves.
I see. Right. Yeah. I mean, I would. Well, with watching TV and movies, you've got 3 different options basically, right? You can watch it in the target language with no subtitles. You can watch it with subtitles in the target language, and you can watch it with subtitles in your language or in a different language, with translations basically. It does sort of depend what you're trying to do, but in general, I think if you're trying to get something out of it from a linguistic perspective, it does you no good whatsoever to have the subtitles in English or in your mother tongue.
Exactly.
Simply because when you've got those, when you can read, so in my case, my mother tongue being English, if I'm reading in English, then I'm no longer concentrating on what's being said. It's a fundamental problem, right? So I think it can be very helpful to have subtitles in the target language, because you can it just helps to give your ear that support, you know, the stuff that you're not hearing, you can see it spelled out. But of course, like the ultimate test is to have no subtitles. Then I think you've got to ask yourself, am I getting anything from it, or is it just too hard for me? Because often it's going to be too hard.
Yes.
If you're just listening with no subtitles, right? So you've got to kind of make that judgment by yourself, like where am I getting the most out of this? Is it with subtitles in the target language or without? And that's the kind of choice that I find myself making.
Yes, I agree totally with you. Just, I think that the question should not be asked after the first episode. I always tell people they should wait at least like 5 episodes, you know, persevere with it, even if you find it very difficult, and then see if it brings you somewhere. Because I totally remember my first episode of Desperate Housewives in French, where I watched it. I always choose very, let's say, simple series, which are about everyday life, not something like sci-fi. I want everyday conversations, and actually these series for women are very good for it, because something happens in the first episode, and within the same episode they talk about it, and they talk about talking about it, and they talk about someone who told someone. It's just a lot of repetition, linguistic repetition. So I watched the first episode, and I had been learning French for about, I don't know, five months by then. So I thought, I will understand something, and I thought I didn't understand anything. Like, I felt totally lost after the episode, and I was a bit disappointed. And I know that many people have gone through that feeling, and they just give up because they think, oh, I'm clearly not on that level, and I'm just not good enough to watch without subtitles. But my experience has been with several languages that I've learned that you just need to make sure you continue. And by the 5th episode, or in my case, it took me about 2 seasons of that series, it started to make sense, really. And it was a beautiful feeling, because you have these chunks of dialogues that suddenly make sense. So I would say don't give up too easily on series without subtitles.
Yeah. And I guess the broader point there is that, I mean, what you're talking about is transitioning from your kind of learning environment, where things are broken down into grammar rules and exercises and lists of vocabulary, where everything is nicely organized for you and arranged by the teacher or by the textbook. It's transitioning from that to what you'd call extensive listening or extensive reading. So, like, listening at length to the language without support. And it's that transition which can be very hard for people. If you've spent all your time in a classroom, then sitting down to watch a TV series in the language can be totally overwhelming, because you've just never done it before.
Right.
But the experience that you've mentioned there of just persisting and just keeping going, keeping an open mind, keeping that belief that you can understand, it can change. It can come quite quickly, can't it? I mean, five episodes of a TV series really isn't that much.
Yeah.
But if the change that happens is that you then have the confidence to actually listen, to watch and listen to this thing in your target language, and you know that you can actually get the meaning from it and understand and appreciate it. That can then change everything, because then you can learn by yourself, really, with enough of that stuff. You don't need to be taught. You can just learn by yourself.
Exactly. And I think this is a very important breakthrough moment for many learners who did make this brave, bold, transition to authentic material, and then they realized, after giving it some time, after being a bit patient with it, like, it's actually understandable. Like, I can use it, and it's so motivational to see, like, I understand authentic content. This is not like, very, very easy stuff which we made understandable to you, but you actually understand authentic content. And you don't understand 100% of it, but you don't need to. In order to follow a simple series, it's enough to understand, I don't know, 70% of it, and you can just guess the other 30%, and it will increase, right? The amount of comprehension will increase. So I think that's very useful.
So we talked about TV series. Presumably, you don't just sit around watching TV all day. So what other things do you like to do?
Yeah, I also love podcasts to learn a language, and it's funny because when you say this to let's say the English-speaking world, then, I mean, obviously this is a podcast which we're doing right now, so people who are listening to this probably know what that means. But in some countries like Slovakia, if you ask 100 people what is a podcast, 15 of them will raise their hand, knowing. So it's really not something which is very popular. So now we're talking to people who know, obviously. But anyway, podcasts are super, super interesting and useful for language learning, I think. And again, you both authentic material.
I heard a statistic somewhere that even in the US, like, only about I'm not totally confident about this number, but something like only 7% of adults have actually ever listened to a podcast.
Really?
It's like, podcasting is funny, because for people who like podcasts, like, their life is podcast. I mean, I just listen to podcasts all day long. Like, I'm a podcast fiend. So the thought that somebody doesn't know podcasts is amazing. But I regularly meet people who tell me I've never listened to a podcast.
Right.
Like, they've got the podcast app on their iPhone and they've just never opened it. So yeah, I think it's an incredible medium.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, we forget that not everybody has used it.
Right. And I think the best podcasts are those that are interviews, such as the one we're doing now, because they're the most natural conversation you can have. You hear the reaction of the people, agreeing, disagreeing, giving opinions, etc. And I definitely do not recommend listening to podcasts which are read, like someone has a script and reads it. That's not a podcast. That's not really useful material for language learning because it's very artificial, and it's much more difficult to follow. This is also the reason why I don't recommend to people to watch like BBC News or CNN, because it's so packed with information. It's difficult to follow even for native speakers often, idea wise.
So I had a different experience most recently. I mean, I think in general I'd agree with that advice. But I had a different experience this summer when I learned Italian. And I'm not sure. Maybe this has to do with, maybe I was able to understand more than I might normally be able to because I was familiar with other languages. But I actually found, because I was so keen to learn through content, through listening and reading, that I went out and I looked for as many podcasts as I could because I really love podcasts and I have lots of time where I can listen. And the podcasts where I got a lot from were definitely those kind of unscripted ones. But I think there is something that's even more important than that. We can have like a trump card, which is that if there is something that you are massively interested in, then that can be, the value of that is such that like scripted, unscripted, doesn't matter because your interest in the topic will pull you through. So in my case with Italian, I actually found this podcast that was incredibly well produced. It was a bit like the NPR podcasts in the US. Very, very well produced, completely scripted. Lots of sound effects and wonderful storytelling and stuff like that. And it was on politics, and it was on the US, the 2016 US election. And there was this guy who was telling stories about all the incredible stories that came out of the US in that year. Good and bad, mostly bad probably, but he was telling these stories in a very good way, and it was just so gripping and so engaging. That even though it was kind of formal language, like you were saying, and it wasn't that kind of spontaneous conversation, I was just so interested in it that I couldn't stop listening to it. And that's kind of like a magic situation there where you like something so much that you can't stop listening to it.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. Actually, I didn't mention this, but when I talk about language learning, I always have to mention like the 4 most important pillars that I have in my philosophy. And the first one of them is fun. So if you find something really enjoyable, it doesn't really matter if it meets any other criteria, just love it and you don't mind spending time with it, and that's the perfect material for you, right? The second one is like a lot of content. This is why I say you have to be patient with series and you have to watch a lot of episodes to actually start seeing some progress. The third one is effective methods, which we are talking about here as well, and being systematic, which we've touched upon in the second part. So yeah, I totally agree. If you are so engaged in something, if you love it, then go for it and just use a lot of it, right? Yeah.
So we've covered TV, we've covered podcasts.
Right. So there's just the 2 ideas about how to get listening content, how to get listening input.
Yeah.
Now, as for reading, we said that if someone just wants to speak fluently, it doesn't really wants like the shortest way, they may not have to worry about reading too much. But I personally love to be able to read the text in the language as well. Like my goal is to be able to have a conversation, understand anything fluently, and be able to read any book in that language. So let's say a non-fiction book. And that's why I definitely recommend reading books in the language. And you can easily go for authentic material if you just find a book which is translated into your language as well. So let's say you're learning French and you want to read Little Prince, and you find it, the French original, and you find the English translation, and you can easily create like a bilingual book where you follow the French text, and if you don't understand anything, you just look it up in the English one. And I think this is a wonderful, simple solution. Everyone can create a language material right like that. And on top of that, you can easily find audiobooks especially for famous books such as Little Prince. For example, on YouTube, if you just put in on YouTube like Little Prince audiobook in French, right? then it will give you a lot of people who actually read the whole story in 1 hour, so you can listen to it at the same time. And I think this combination of reading and listening is wonderful. It really does magic. So, and that's so simple, right? Like if someone listens to this, they have never learned any language by themselves, they can just do this, start doing it, do a lot of it, find a book they love, and they will see what magic it does to their language skills.
There's we mentioned how podcasts, often people don't know about podcasts. There's another thing that I really like, but I've realized recently that many people don't know about, which is that if you use Amazon Kindle to read, then you've got kind of one-touch dictionaries on those devices, and dictionaries are a funny thing because people love their dictionaries, but usually it kind of really slows you down, right? Because you're reading a book, you have to put it down and pick up the dictionary and find the word, and it really slows you down. But if you're reading on a Kindle, you can just tap a word and get an instant definition. Yeah. That allows you to keep moving through the text and keep enjoying it, right? Which is another great way to just to get that content. But I think there is an issue there, though, isn't there, with like the level that you're reading at? Because I mean, even if how do you think about that? So you mentioned reading authentic content. I mean, reading authentic novels, for example, in a second language is usually pretty tough. So I mean, how do you think about that from a level perspective, and when would you start to do that?
I always recommend people to work with material which is slightly above their current level. So if I'm a complete beginner, I will not go for an authentic novel because I will not understand anything, right? But I would go for simplified texts, simplified short stories, And if I'm already at a level, because my experience is many people have really spent a lot of years learning a language, but they have never really used it in practice. They never practice a lot of speaking. But once they start doing a lot of listening, reading, watching series, listening to podcasts, reading books, they can achieve a good B1 level very, very quickly. And I think with a good B1 level, where you're almost getting to the B2 level, which means very fluent in everyday topics, you can easily use authentic books, no problem. So in general, I would say one level above. But I never recommend people to start with novels and fiction because I think it's very difficult. What I find a lot easier is practical books, on any topic that interests you. Let's say, how to, I don't know if you are interested in business, marketing or business, or how to have good presentation skills, how to be a leader, how to raise your kids.
How to learn a language.
Yeah, exactly. That's good material as well. Yeah. This is so much easier than fiction, because with fiction you get a lot of, with fiction, it's not just about the content, it's about how it is said, right? How it is written. And authors like to play around with words, and they like to use unusual words. And often if it's like a historical novel, then you are learning 18th century vocabulary, which you don't really need.
Yeah.
So
where do you stand on children's books? Because as everybody knows, if you want to learn a language, just read kids' books. Easy.
I hate that advice, and I never give it to people, because if Slovaks ask me, I give them an example of a book by Dobzhinsky, who was a big author in the 19th century. And I don't understand the Slovak that he uses, it's very complicated. And I would never say it's not natural. It's just this funny way of speaking, which is interesting to kids. But I don't find it very natural. And the vocabulary that is used there is not particularly useful in my opinion. There are, of course, some modern things and children books which might be useful. Like, for example, Harry Potter was my favorite resource when I learned several languages. But in general, I don't think it's that much easier to work with children's books. I always say, make sure it's material that would interest you in your language as well. So I'm not a big fan of reading children's books by myself, just for myself. So I would rather find a self-help book that actually teaches me something. For example, a good example is The Miracle Morning. Have you heard about that book?
Yeah, I've read that book, yeah.
It's such a good one. I've read it in French, which is one of my weaker languages. And I loved it. I didn't even realize it was in French, because I was like, oh my God, this guy says I could wake up at 5 a.m. and be happy about it. I just read it so fast. It was so easy to learn, to read.
Yeah, I read a book this summer in Italian called Riconquista il tuo tempo. So reclaim, I guess, your time, get your time back.
That's a perfect topic to
so easy, like so like the language, very straightforward language, you know, very useful. Like I'm interested in that anyway.
Time management tips.
I just learned so much from it, and also because the language was quite simple. Actually, when there are kind of nice little expressions and phrases, colloquial phrases that come in there, I can actually understand those, and I can kind of take them and use them for my own.
Yeah. People always go for like, you know, they want to learn Russian, so they start reading Dostoevsky. Or, I mean, it's
Notes from underground.
That's so difficult. So, but the problem is, if you look for like really bilingual materials in bookshops, these are the books you will find, right?
Yeah.
So very old books, because of authors' rights, copyright, stuff like that. It's easy to turn these books into bilingual books, not modern literature. But that's why I suggest just, you know, get a copy, like the original copy and the translation which you understand, and just use it.
So what you've outlined for us here is the kind of the big picture path through the language learning process. And it's interesting, we haven't spoken about activities or exercises, which is probably what people are expecting, right? It's like, okay, well, what activities do you do? Do you do gap fills or whatever? But what you focused on here is content. We talked about TV series for listening. We talked about podcasts also for listening. We talked about books and other material for reading. So tie that all together for us then. How does this all kind of come together to get you to a point where you know the language?
Right. So if you want to get to the point where you speak the language, don't worry about speaking at the very beginning. Go for a lot of input first, which means listening and reading, and just realize that you will need a lot of that input. It will not happen if you read one story or one text. You really need to read the whole book to feel some progress in your language. You need to have seen, you know, 3 seasons of a series to feel like you understand more. And this will only happen if you find materials which you are personally interested in and which are usable for your level. So if you do that, then I think these activities, I mean, I'm okay speaking about particular activities, what to do with it, but I think this is much more important from a broader perspective, because if you find one good resource, let's say a book which you really love reading, and a series which you love watching, or a podcast which you really love listening to, you don't need to persuade yourself to do it because you want to do it. Like, you wake up in the morning like, oh, I can read another 10 pages of this amazing book and discover new vocabulary, right? So I think this is really the key, finding some enjoyable material and spending a lot of time with it in a systematic way.
Wonderful. All right then. So in part 1, we covered the mindset that you need for learning. In part 2, we talked about the importance of time and priority. What we've talked about here is the actual kind of engine of learning. What results in you learning the language through reading and listening. In part 4, we're going to get onto the fun stuff, which is speaking.
Yes.
So don't go anywhere. If you're listening to this on the podcast, so make sure you subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button so that you get notified about the next part of this and anything else that comes up. And Lydia, I guess I'll see you back for part 4.
I can't wait.